I know you have waited. I am here, Jerusalem.
In July 1187, the sun hangs over the kingdom of Jerusalem like a judge's gavel. It is the height of summer in the Holy Land, a season where the heat itself becomes a weapon, turning chainmail into ovens and drying the throats of men until they can no longer scream. King Guy of Lusignan stands in his tent at the springs of Saffuriya, staring at a map that offers him two choices. To the east lies the city of Tiberias, besieged by the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin. To the west lies safety. The decision he makes in this tent will not just determine the fate of a city, it will decide the future of the Middle East for the next 1,000 years. It is a decision that will break the back of the Crusades, erase the kingdom of heaven from the map, and stain the sands of Galilee with the blood of 20,000 men. But to understand why a king would march his entire army into a death trap, we must first understand the man waiting for him in the shadows. Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West simply as Saladin, was unlike any enemy the Crusaders had faced before. He was not a raider interested in plunder, nor a warlord fighting for a patch of land. He was a unifier. For decades, the Islamic world had been fractured, a collection of squabbling city-states that the Crusaders had easily exploited. But Saladin had spent 20 years stitching these wounds together, combining the wealth of Egypt with the military might of Syria. By 1187, he had forged a steel ring around the Crusader states. He had the men, he had the resources, and most importantly, he had the patience. Saladin knew he could not take the great fortresses of Jerusalem, Kerak, or Acre by force, not while the Crusader field army remained intact. Their heavy cavalry, the knightly orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, were the tanks of the medieval world. On open ground, their charge was unstoppable. So, Saladin devised a different plan. He would not attack their castles. He would make them come to him. He chose his killing ground carefully, the arid plateau between Saffuriya and Tiberias, a landscape of baked rock and dry scrub, where the only water sources were controlled by his army. Then, he laid the bait. He marched his army to Tiberias and laid siege to the city. Inside the walls of Tiberias was the wife of Count Raymond of Tripoli, a high-ranking Crusader lord. Saladin knew the chivalric code of the Franks would demand a response. They could not sit idly by while a noblewoman was captured. He was gambling everything on the pride of his enemy. Back at the springs of Saffuriya, the trap was closing, but the Crusaders were tearing themselves apart from the inside. The war council held on the night of July 2nd was legendary for its bitterness. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the largest ever assembled, over 1,200 knights and 18,000 infantry. But its leadership was fractured by jealousy and hatred. On one side stood Count Raymond of Tripoli. He was a veteran of the desert, a man who spoke Arabic and understood Saladin better than anyone. He pleaded with King Guy to stay put, let Tiberias fall. Raymond argued, "My wife is there, but I would rather lose her and my city than lose the kingdom." His logic was sound. At Saffuriya, the Crusaders had ample water and a strong defensive position. If they stayed there, Saladin would be forced to withdraw when his supplies ran out. The desert, Raymond insisted, was Saladin's ally, not theirs. To march across that dry plateau in July was suicide, but opposing him was Raynald of Châtillon. If Saladin was the scalpel, Raynald was the rusty hammer, a brutal, reckless lord who had spent years provoking the Muslims, raiding caravans during truces and torturing captives for sport. He hated Saladin, and he hated Raymond even more. "You speak like a coward," Raynald sneered at Raymond. He turned to the king, playing on his insecurities. King Guy was a weak ruler, recently crowned and desperate to prove his legitimacy. Raynald whispered the words that would seal their doom. "If you do not march, you are no king. You are leaving Christians to be slaughtered while you hide in the shade." Also present was Gerard de Ridefort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He backed Raynald, eager for a fight. To men like Gerard, caution was indistinguishable from heresy. God was on their side. Tactics were for non-believers. The argument raged late into the night. At first, King Guy seemed to side with reason. He ordered the army to stay. But long after the council dispersed, under the cover of darkness, Gerard de Ridefort returned to the king's tent. He preyed on Guy's fear of being seen as weak. He reminded him of the English gold that paid for their soldiers, gold that would stop flowing if they didn't fight. By dawn on July 3rd, the king's mind was changed. The order was given. The army would march. When the sun rose, The Crusaders left the life-saving waters of Saffuriya behind. They moved in a massive column, miles long. The Templars took the vanguard. The king held the center with the true cross, a relic believed to be a piece of the actual cross of Christ, and the Hospitallers guarded the rear. They had to cover only 12 miles to reach water at the Sea of Galilee, a 4-hour march on a cool day. But this was not a cool day. As soon as they left the shade of the orchards, the heat hit them like a physical blow. Temperatures soared past 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Underneath their padding, chainmail and surcoats, the knights began to sweat profusely. Dehydration set in within the first hour, and then the arrows began. Saladin's light cavalry, the Turkish horse archers, appeared on the ridges like ghosts. They didn't charge. They hovered at the edge of bowshot, raining arrows down on the slow-moving column. They targeted the horses, knowing that a knight on foot was just a man in an oven. The Crusader column was forced to tighten up. The infantry, wearing less armor, huddled around the cavalry for protection. This slowed the pace to a crawl. Every time they stopped to dress their lines, the sun beat down harder. By noon, they had covered only a few miles. The waterskins were running dry. The men began to hallucinate. Saladin, watching from the hills, saw the plan working perfectly. He ordered his wings to sweep around the Crusader rear, cutting off their retreat to Saffuriya. The door had slammed shut behind them. Desperate, King Guy ordered the army to push for the springs at Turan, a midpoint on the journey. But when they arrived, they found the wells destroyed or dry. The only water left was at the Sea of Galilee, still miles away across the burning plateau. The discipline of the army began to fray. The rear guard, commanded by Balian of Ibelin and the Hospitallers, was under constant assault. They were fighting a running battle, walking backward, shields raised against a sky that had turned black with arrows. "We cannot go on," the message came from the rear. "We must stop." King Guy looked at the sun, then at the exhausted faces of his men. He made his second fatal mistake. Instead of pushing through the pain to reach the lake, he ordered the army to halt and make camp. They were in the middle of nowhere, no water, no walls, just open desert. As the sun set, the Crusaders collapsed where they stood. They were surrounded by the enemy, parched with thirst, and listening to the sounds of the Muslim army celebrating just out of reach. Saladin's men poured water onto the sand within sight of the Crusader lines, a psychological torture designed to break their spirits before the battle even truly began. That night, no one slept. The prayers of the Christian soldiers were drowned out by the beat of Saracen drums. They knew that when the sun rose, it would not bring relief, it would bring the end. The night of July 3rd was not a time of rest, it was a prelude to hell. Surrounded on all sides, the 20,000 men of the Crusader army lay in the dirt, their tongues swollen, their lips cracked and bleeding. The silence of the desert was broken only by the rhythmic, maddening beat of drums and tambourines from the Muslim camp. Saladin ordered his men to chant prayers and shout insults throughout the darkness, ensuring that anxiety would finish what the thirst had started. But the psychological torture was more than just noise. Scouts from Saladin's army crept close to the Crusader lines, setting up camel caravans laden with waterskins. They poured the precious liquid onto the sand, letting the sound of splashing water drift toward the dying men. It was a cruelty that bordered on genius. By the time the first grey light of dawn touched the horizon on July 4th, the Crusader army was already broken in spirit. They were camped on the slopes of a hill with two distinct peaks, known locally as the Horns of Hattin. It was a volcanic formation, ancient and jagged, offering high ground but no shelter. Below them, blocking the path to the Sea of Galilee, waited Saladin's main force. King Guy attempted to organize his men for a final push. The plan was simple, born of desperation: smash through the Muslim lines to reach the lake. There was no strategy left, only the primal need to drink. As the sun crested the hills, the temperature began its rapid climb. The wind picked up, blowing from the east, hot, dry, and directly into the faces of the Crusaders. Saladin had been waiting for this wind. At his signal, Muslim skirmishers ran forward with torches. The dry scrub and long grass that covered the plateau, brittle after months of summer heat, ignited instantly. A wall of fire roared to life, sweeping toward the Crusader lines. If the thirst was agonizing, the smoke was suffocating. Thick, acrid clouds engulfed the Christian army, stinging their eyes and filling their parched lungs with ash. The Crusaders were now fighting blind, coughing and retching, while hidden archers fired volley after volley into the grey haze. The arrows fell like rain, striking men who couldn't even see where the death was coming from. Panic, which had been bubbling under the surface for 2 days, finally erupted. The Crusader infantry, the backbone of the army's defense, broke. These were the men tasked with protecting the horses of the knights, forming a shield wall against the enemy arrows. But the combination of heat, thirst, smoke and fear was too much. Ignoring the commands of their officers, thousands of foot soldiers broke formation. They didn't run toward the enemy to fight. They ran toward the steep cliffs of the Horns, scrabbling up the rocks in a desperate attempt to escape the heat and the arrows. They huddled together at the summit, refusing to fight, paralyzed by the extremity of their suffering. King Guy screamed at them to return to the line, to support the knights, but they were beyond hearing. "We are not coming down," they cried out. "We are dying of thirst." This was the moment the battle was truly lost. Without the infantry to screen them, the heavy cavalry of the Knights Templar and Hospitallers was exposed. The most feared military unit in Christendom, the Iron Fist that had crushed Muslim armies for 80 years, was now a sitting duck. Saladin saw the separation. He tightened the noose. His cavalry moved in, not to charge head-on, but to harass and exhaust. The Mamluks, Saladin's elite slave soldiers, darted in and out of the smoke, striking at the exposed flanks of the knights. Horses, maddened by terror and wounds, threw their riders or collapsed. A knight on the ground in the middle of a desert summer is a helpless creature. The heavy armor that made them invincible in a charge became a metal coffin. Many knights didn't die from sword cuts. They died from heat stroke, boiling alive inside their own suits of mail. Yet even in this apocalypse, the Crusaders showed flashes of the ferocity that had made them legendary. Count Raymond of Tripoli, commanding the vanguard, saw the encirclement closing. He gathered his household knights, a small wedge of steel in a sea of enemies, and launched a suicidal charge. They thundered down the hill, aiming for a weak point in the Muslim line commanded by Saladin's nephew. The charge was so ferocious, so driven by the sheer will to survive, that the Muslim troops actually opened their ranks. They let Raymond pass through, refusing to stand in the way of such momentum. Raymond and his men shot through the gap and kept riding, escaping the slaughter. They were the only significant force to leave Hattin alive. But for the rest, there was no escape. With Raymond gone and the infantry cowering on the peaks, the remaining knights were squeezed into a tight redoubt around the king's tent. In the center of this doomed circle stood the true cross. The relic, encased in gold and jewels, was the spiritual anchor of the kingdom. To the knights fighting beneath it, this was not just a battle for survival. It was a battle for God. They rallied around it, fighting with the hysterical strength of men who know they are about to meet their maker. Saladin's son, Al-Afdal, who was watching the battle from his father's side, would later recount the intensity of this final stand. He watched as the Crusaders, reduced to a handful of survivors, launched charge after charge against the tightening Muslim ring. "They are beaten," the young prince shouted when the Crusaders were pushed back. But Saladin, watching with the cold eye of a veteran, shook his head. "Be silent," he told his son. "They are not beaten until that tent falls." The Sultan knew that a cornered animal is the most dangerous. He ordered a final, crushing assault. Thousands of fresh troops poured up the slopes, stepping over the bodies of the fallen, pushing the exhausted knights back step by bloody step. The clash of steel was deafening, but slowly the resistance began to fade. Swords became too heavy to lift. Shields were battered into splinters. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, the man whose arrogance had led them into this trap, was dragged from his horse and taken prisoner. Then, a great cry went up from the Muslim ranks. The red tent of King Guy, the symbol of royal authority, collapsed. Its ropes had been cut. At the same moment, the bearer of the true cross was cut down, and the holy relic was seized by Saladin's troops. The heart of the crusade had stopped beating. Silence began to fall over the horns of Hattin. The fighting died down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the victorious shouts of Allahu Akbar ringing out across the smoky plateau. The battlefield was a landscape of carnage, littered with the flower of European nobility dead among the dry grass. King Guy, Raynald of Châtillon, and the surviving barons were rounded up. They were stripped of their armor and weapons, their hands bound, and led toward the tent of the victor. The battle was over. The judgment was about to begin. The heat of the day had finally broken, replaced by the cooling winds of the evening, but inside the Sultan's pavilion, the air was heavy with anticipation. The tent was a palace of silken canvas, a stark contrast to the blood-soaked rocks just a few hundred yards away. King Guy of Lusignan and Raynald of Châtillon were brought in. They were covered in dust, sweat and soot, stumbling with exhaustion. They looked less like lords of the realm and more like beggars. Saladin sat on a raised cushion, flanked by his generals and his son, watching them with an expression that was impossible to read. This meeting would become one of the most famous moments in medieval history, a scene where the code of chivalry collided with the brutal reality of vengeance. King Guy was trembling. It was not just fear, it was severe dehydration. Saladin, noticing the king's condition, signaled to a servant. A goblet was brought forward, filled with water cooled by snow brought from Mount Hermon, a luxury that seemed miraculous in the middle of the desert. Saladin offered the cup to the king. Guy drank greedily, the water life-giving after days of torment. But then, in a gesture of camaraderie, Guy passed the goblet to Raynald of Châtillon, who stood beside him. Raynald raised the cup to his lips. Suddenly, Saladin's voice cut through the silence like a whip. "Tell the king," Saladin said to his interpreter, his eyes locked on Guy, "that it is he who has given this man a drink, not I." The distinction was lethal. In the Arab custom of the time, dakil, if a prisoner was given food or water by his captor, his life was safe. By refusing to offer the water to Raynald personally, Saladin was signaling that the old lord was still a dead man walking. Raynald drank, wiping his mouth, perhaps believing his rank would still protect him. He was wrong. Saladin stood up. He walked over to Raynald and reminded him of his crimes, the caravans he had butchered, the pilgrims he had tortured, and the insults he had hurled against the Prophet Muhammad. "I swore to kill you with my own hand," Saladin said quietly. Before Raynald could respond, Saladin drew his scimitar. With a single violent motion, he struck Raynald, slicing through his shoulder and neck. As the old lord fell to the ground, Saladin's guards rushed in to finish him, dragging the body out of the tent by its feet. King Guy, watching his ally butchered in front of him, fell to his knees, convinced he was next. But Saladin's demeanor shifted instantly. He returned to his seat, sheathed his sword, and motioned for the king to rise. "A king does not kill a king," Saladin told him, "but that man, he went too far." King Guy was spared, sent to captivity in Damascus, but for the rest of the Crusader army, there would be no such mercy. Saladin knew that the Knights Templar and Hospitaller were the only force in the Holy Land capable of stopping him. They were fanatics, sworn to fight to the death. To let them live was to invite them to fight again. 2 days after the battle, on Monday, July 6th, Saladin ordered the surviving knights of the military orders to be brought before him. There were about 200 of them. He gave them a simple choice: convert to Islam or die. Not a single knight converted. In a gruesome spectacle, Saladin allowed the religious scholars and Sufis in his camp, men who had never held a sword, to perform the executions. It was a messy, chaotic end for the most elite warriors of Christendom, beheaded in the dust of the Galilee. With the army destroyed, the king captured, and the knights executed, the kingdom of Jerusalem was a ghost. The news of the defeat at Hattin spread like a shockwave. Castles and cities, stripped of their garrisons to feed the army at Hattin, surrendered one by one. Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, they all opened their gates. There was no one left to defend them. By September, Saladin stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The holy city was defended by Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman who had escaped Hattin, but he had almost no soldiers. He was commanding a garrison of boys and old men. They held out for weeks, threatening to destroy the Islamic holy sites if Saladin did not grant them terms, but the end was inevitable. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. Unlike the Crusaders, who had waded through blood up to their ankles when they captured the city 88 years earlier, Saladin allowed the Christians to ransom themselves. The cross on the dome of the rock was torn down, the call to prayer rang out over the city, and the kingdom of heaven was no more. The Battle of Hattin was more than just a military defeat, it was a lesson in hubris. King Guy and Raynald of Châtillon had believed that zealotry and aggression were enough to secure victory. They believed that God would protect them, regardless of their tactical blunders. They ignored the terrain, the climate, and the wisdom of their own advisors. They marched into the desert believing they were the hunters, only to realize too late that they were the prey. When news of the fall of Jerusalem reached Europe, the shock was so great that it is said Pope Urban III died of a heart attack instantly. It would trigger the Third Crusade, bringing Richard the Lionheart to the shores of the Holy Land in a desperate attempt to undo the damage. But while Richard would win battles, he would never retake Jerusalem. The window of opportunity had closed on that scorching day in July. The horns of Hattin still stand today, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. They are silent now, covered in grass and wildflowers. But if you stand there in the height of summer, when the heat makes the air shimmer and the wind blows hot from the east, you can almost hear it. You can hear the clatter of armor, the roar of the fire, and the desperate prayers of men who realized, in their final moments, that they had been led not into glory, but into the sun. It remains history's most brutal reminder that in war, the most dangerous enemy is often not the army across the field, but the arrogance within your own ranks.